Hey guys, welcome to another riveting episode of the PC Perspective Mailbag. I'm Ryan Shrout. Thank you guys for joining us. Really enjoyed doing these little segments. These are fun. I think you guys are getting a kick out of it as well. We're seeing a lot of great questions come in. If you have a question you want answered on this little mailbag segment here, leave it in the comments to the YouTube video here. And we have Jim is helping me go through them and pick out some good ones and put them in the list for me. So we'll see how many we can get through here this afternoon on this late Thursday in August, not late August and Thursday. Meatball CB asks, why do hard drive manufacturers release external hard drives at a lower price than internal versions? Are they bidding lower quality hard drives for external units, or is there something else going on that accounts for the large price difference? This is a really interesting discussion, right? And it's obviously a recent thing for us even here, as people started finding that some 8 terabyte WD red drives were showing up in external drive units, external drive bays, for significantly lower cost than you could buy them an OEM drive like on Newegg or Amazon, which led to a lot of drives and trips to Best Buy here as we attempt to populate out larger file servers. So the reasons for this are manyfold. One is there's absolutely some binning that's occurring. The drives that go into the hard drives, physical hard drives that go into external drive units, don't have the same specifications, and they don't have the specific claims put against them, right? There's no seek times, there's no specific transfer rates, there's no specific those two qualities, right? And also they have lower warranties, right? If you notice, the external drives have a 3-year warranty instead of a 5-year warranty in many cases. So the differences lie in some of that, right? And then keep in mind that at any point they can switch that from a WD red drive to a WD blue to, to a WD whatever they happen to create, or some white label brand that never really existed before. This gives them the flexibility to, if they overproduced on the red, they're not selling as many in the channels they thought, they go, okay, rather than have them sit on a warehouse dock forever, put them in these drives. We don't have to make any new ones for that for the next quarter or whatever happens to be. So there's definitely some of that. Also keep in mind that your mom and dad that go into a store aren't going to be willing to pay very much for, and they're not going to be expected to pay, the same price for an 8 terabyte WD red that you might pay in the channel, right? They're just not going to be able to eat that type of cost. So whatever happens, whatever drives happen to be the cheapest for them, not the cheapest to manufacture, but the cheapest of them at that moment, is what you're gonna find in there. So there's definitely some binning, and there's no like trickery. They're not trying to fool you or anything like that, and they're not trying to rip you off on the higher end parts. It's just a matter of what parts that they happen to have laying around. If you get lucky every once in a while and you feel gutsy enough to go to Best Buy, buy 3 drives, and shuck them out of that stuff and use them for something, you can absolutely do that. So we are apparently always on the lookout for things of that nature. ZKid1070 wants to know, we have not heard much lately from DX12, which was supposedly able to use the total memory of both video cards in its, quote, SLI mode. Is DirectX 12 dead? These are two very different questions. So multi-GPU in DirectX 12 is very complicated because it exists in 3 different modes. I'm not going to try to go through all of them. Essentially, there was a mode that existed like SLI Crossfire in the past, and then there's an in-between mode where the game engine has to be aware of the 2 nodes, but it leaves some of the work to the driver and the system to figure out. And then there's the other complete side of that, where the GPU is responsible, or the game engine rather, is responsible for all of the memory management, all of the data manipulation, what memory capacities and what sections they're using, all that stuff exists. That's still there, but as we kind of thought at the time, and as it's turning out to be the case, it's pretty difficult to do, and not a lot of game engines are implementing it, at least very effectively. Also worth noting, fewer and fewer people are using multiple GPUs in their system, so there's even less of a need to really get into that type of messy work if you're a developer or an engine developer, for less gain than there would have been even before. I still think there's value to multiple GPUs as we get into some of this stuff, but we'll see how that progresses. As for like DX12 being dead just in general, no, it's 100% not dead. It is still growing. It is still going to be very important, right? I mean, all of the Xbox stuff is going to be DX12 based. All of that will come over into the PC space, even more so than we're at now. We're still in this in-between world where very few games are going to come out. They're going to be DX12 only and or Vulkan only. They're going to need to be both because of compatibility issues, older graphics cards, older drivers, older OSs. Keep in mind that DX12 only only works on Windows 10. So there is something like that to keep in mind as well. So no, DirectX 12 not dead. Dipper315 wants to know, hey Ryan, I'm looking to buy a laptop for college and light gaming on the go. I was wondering if he should go with a laptop with the NVIDIA 940MX or the Intel Integrated Graphics HD620. Which one would you prefer or recommend? Dipper, for gaming, the 940MX is going to be better than your HD620 by a significant margin, but not a night and day difference, right? The 940MX is a little bit old in the tooth now. It was always meant to be a super low power, low performance part to fit into some of these thin and light machines, but it is going to be better than any Intel integrated graphics that exist today. So you're kind of in an interesting spot there because the two options you gave me, I would not really consider great for gaming, and you didn't really define what light gaming actually meant. If we're talking CSGO and Dota 2 and applications like that, maybe StarCraft Remastered that we played this week, the 940MX is going to do fine, and chances are the HD620 is going to be okay too. If you're trying to get into something like lower resolution, even like Rocket League, for example, it's going to be tougher on those the Intel HD graphics than it is on a 940MX. Of those two options, I would go with the NVIDIA 940MX, though don't be surprised to find some instances where the 940MX is left wanting. Keep that in mind as you go through that. If you can afford to look at a machine like the Dell XPS 15 that has a GTX 1050 or 1050 Ti in it, you're going to see a significant increase in your gaming capability there. The Dell XPS 15 is a machine I've been looking at for my own personal use very closely recently as I try to balance the same types of things that you are. Robert Galloway wants to know, how much does the CPU matter when gaming at 4K? Very game dependent, very game engine dependent. In general, the CPU is going to matter significantly less at 4K than it will at a lower resolution, in general. And we've seen that, right? So when we've been looking at gaming performance recently, a lot of focus on, say, AMD Ryzen Threadripper versus Intel Skylake X, Core i9 7900X. At 1080p, the Intel performance benefits are there, right? At 1080p gaming, the gaming advantage goes to Intel. It has higher single-threaded processing capability, lower memory latency, and that kind of comes to show there. When we move up to even 25x14, 2560x1440, those differences compress a little bit. And when we were doing testing at 4K, which we did do in our Threadripper review, so if you want to go to PCPer.com and look at our Threadripper review, you can do that. We do test 4K. Those differences are compressed even further, almost to the point of being within any margin of error. At 4K, in general, your CPU is not going to matter a dramatic amount, unless, of course, you're going to be crazy about stuff, and you're trying to use like a dual core part, like a Pentium 9560 G6590. I don't remember the model number now. Like the Pentium dual core hyper-threaded. Like now you're going to start to struggle where you're going to see bottlenecks in a whole bunch of areas with gaming. But if you're using like a Skylake 7700K, if you're using a Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 5, and you have a GTX 1080 Ti, you're going to do as good as 4K gaming as you would with any higher-end processor, with a couple of exceptions here or there depending on the game, right? Whether it be Ashes of the Singularity or something else, right? So keep that in mind. The CPU matters less at 4K, although as we move forward in the future, as more game engines kind of get pressure from AMD and Intel for releasing these high core count processors, it's possible that the CPU will matter more in the not too distant future. Here we go. This is a question from, I'm going to screw up this name, Per Stian de Granes. asks, you looked at the Asus Zephyrus laptop a while back. Did you try to get it to work with an external G-Sync display? Since it doesn't have a DisplayPort output, you mentioned it might work with USB-C to DisplayPort. I can't find anyone who seems to have tested this. We have not tested this, but we do, in fact, have a USB-C to DisplayPort adapter that we got in very recently, so I think it's something we can take a look at. Because I think you also left a comment about this on our review or on the YouTube review of this particular product. So I don't know if it works. I would expect it to work. I would be disappointed if it didn't work. But, you know, USB Type-C, Thunderbolt, all that stuff is very new, so we'll give it a shot and see. I'm always very curious when we look into the world of gaming notebooks if external displays are the norm or the exception, right? So if you have a gaming notebook like a Zephyrus or, you know, one of the bigger MSI or Asus machines, do you bring it home and hook it up to an external display to game, or are you always kind of gaming on that monitor? I'd be curious to see some comments about that if you happen to be in that user base. But I'll try to get Ken to try that out later this week if we have the opportunity, just to see if it works. I think that'd be a valuable data point. Paul Hack wants to know, do you have any recommendations for external water cooling solutions similar to the Zalman Reserator? There aren't many options left on the market from what I can find. You are correct. There are not many options left on the market. I used to use these exclusively on our CPU and GPU test beds, the Coolant's Exos units, EXOS, that I had. They were external water cooling units that had, you know, the reservoir, the radiator, the pump, all in this external unit with, you know, handles and LED lights telling you the fan speeds and temperatures of things. They were really neat. It became a pain to update water blocks. You know, we were getting new GPUs in that didn't have water blocks yet, and new CPUs in that didn't have water blocks yet, so we're using air coolers, and then the hassle of switching between the air cooler that was working just fine for our purposes back to the water cooler just for noise and stuff like that. It seemed to be a little bit of a not a great use of time, I would say. But they have become much more difficult to find. The Zalman Reserator, I looked up real quick, is that enormous tower beast. I don't know of any other ones that exist. I would welcome comments from the viewers on what they recommend for this. The all-in-one, you know, all integrated water cooler has kind of taken over for that, for CPU cooling and then GPU cooling. You know, not a whole lot of people do chipset water blocks and stuff like that in VRMs. There's still that audience out there. You know, Asus still makes those you know, Zenith Extreme motherboards and what have you that will support full coverage water blocks over the CPU and the VRMs and all that stuff that are super cool, but it's a niche market, and unfortunately for niche markets, you have a smaller user base, smaller pool of money from which companies to kind of go after, and so they're going to make less products along the way as that happens. So if anybody has any external solutions for Paul, let us know in the comments. Richard Byrne asks, an open airflow case with low-speed fans or a silence focus case like the Define R5 being more restrictive with higher speed fans. Which do you think would end up being quieter, assuming the same component temperatures? I think the assumption of same component temperatures screws us up a little bit. So an open air case with low fan speeds, which is essentially what we do. You can't really see it back here, but behind that Coca-Cola can or near that Coca-Cola zero sugar can is an open air test case, an open air system that, you know, doesn't have any external fans because it's all ambient air all around it. The reason you have case fans is to bring external air into a system that is kind of self-heating, right, as you've got those components inside. With an open air system, the ambient temperature is all around every, you know, the water cooler for the processor or the air cooler for the GPU. You don't really have to worry about that. So you don't even really need, you know, low speed case fans in that regard. You don't really need any case fans at all, in my experience. The silence focus cases of the Define R5 and whatnot that are restrictive, and so you have to have those case fans in there, maybe running a little bit harder than you would otherwise in order to get the air in. In general, those are going to be quieter. And in my experience, even in reality, having something like, again, you can't see it back there, but there is a Vega 64 Liquid on there. Getting that fan and the fan for like a Vega 64 air-cooled or GTX 1080 Ti, getting those fans into a case and maybe even under your desk is going to make a world of difference if you're looking to get a quieter machine. So while open air is cool looking and sexy and potentially you can run fans at lower speeds, in general, I still think you're going to do much better if you put these in a case, even like a normal case, I think, and put it underneath your desk or a little bit further away, whatever you happen to do. I think those noise dampening cases, if you look at the reviews that we've posted on our site, they do a really good job, and I have no problem recommending them on that too. So, 5 Basher wants to know, I've been wondering since you guys did the Ryzen Infinity Fabric testing if there is any speed difference in PCIe lanes between Intel and AMD. In other words, assuming the same on-paper specifications, are all PCIe lanes created equal? So a good question. Complex answer, I guess. So I would say the bandwidth you should assume from all of these PCIe lanes will be the same. They have to meet that minimum specification, so bandwidth of speed will be the same. What's interesting is when you get into the whole latency discussion again. So when we looked at the Ryzen Infinity Fabric testing, and we were kind of testing the core-to-core latency across CCXs and across die on Threadripper, you're really looking at the latency differences more so than any bandwidth differences. So there is the way the architectures of, say, Skylake X versus Threadripper are developed. The PCIe controllers are laid out and placed differently. So the CCXs, so let's take worst case scenario for AMD, a Threadripper processor, you've got 2 8-core die. If a core on this die over here wants to communicate with a device that is attached to a PCIe bus over here, it has to cross CCX, it has to cross across the 2 die interface and then back into that particular CCX and out to that PCIe channel and back again. That's kind of a worst case scenario, and that's where you're hitting higher latency. Now, with all things in latency and bandwidth, same thing with like your internet connection. If you have a 200 millisecond ping, that's bad, but if you're watching streaming video, it doesn't really matter if your bandwidth is high. Same would apply here. So if the application or game or whatever is not latency sensitive, but it's bandwidth sensitive, it won't really matter. If it's latency sensitive, it will. So not all PCIe lanes are created equal depending on what the sensitivity is. If you look at Skylake X, it has divided up the PCIe lanes into little chunks, a couple different chunks, trying to make it more easily accessible to the different cores that are using a mesh interface as opposed to a fabric CCX or the old style ring interface. So there are going to be differences between them. In general, I haven't seen any instances where the PCIe problems are super noticeable, even on Threadripper, where that worst case exists. But we haven't really done a whole lot of multi-GPU testing on Threadripper, and that will be something that I think we'll spend some more time on and evaluate. That's kind of like an interesting next step, if you will. Marlo Mitchell wants to know, what do I think of the Windows 10 game mode, and do I think it really matters to the PC community? I don't know what to think about game mode. I think it has the potential to be really interesting. So Windows 10 is introducing game mode through its updates, and the idea that they have put forward, with not a whole lot of detail, honestly, is that they want to give priority to the threads and applications of the game while you are gaming, right? In other words, kind of easily set priority to these game engine threads so that they get better access to memory, better access to resources. You're not waiting on any background tasks. You're not waiting on any of that type of stuff to occur. Instead, a whole focus on gaming. There's all kinds of things they could do as well. They could, modify the DirectX API to be a little bit more low level when in game mode, to be a little bit more aggressive on clock speeds and memory timings and stuff like that, right? They could kind of ramp everything up and keep it all going full speed, obviously at the expense of power consumption. I don't think it matters to the PC community today. The benchmarks that we've seen, that some of the guys I know that have done testing that I trust, you know, you're talking about a couple of percent one way or the other, not a huge difference, but they're you know, Microsoft has basically said this is going to be a progressive rollout. They're going to make changes to this as they go. So I expect that to get a little bit better. And honestly, the advantage of console gaming has always been lower level access to hardware. If Microsoft can get to a point where even if it requires like a reboot and you can reboot your machine into game mode and you lose access to other things, but you gain lower level access to hardware and your drivers and your game engines can work a little bit more console-like in that way, I think it might be a pretty big improvement. It's going to take a pretty big commitment on Microsoft part to really get that to work. Let's do one or two more. Rasana Shinde asks, do you really feel any difference between a SATA-based SSD and an NVMe SSD? For example, a Samsung 850 Pro versus a 960 Pro in gaming, browsing, or other normal stuff. And I talked with Alan right before I recorded this and kind of got his opinion on this too, because my initial gut reaction is not really. You're not really going to feel a difference in opening up your applications or running Word or web browsing or something like that, moving from a SATA-based SSD to an NVMe SSD. The latencies on SATA SSDs are still low enough that the user experience is still really good. Now, if you're a super heavy multitasking user, there are instances where you will feel, just inherently feel that performance difference. There are also a couple of cases that we found in testing, like some game load times are affected in a move from SATA to NVMe SSDs. Ashes of the Singularity, another example there. For whatever reason, its loading pattern and its algorithms and how it accesses data from your primary drive saw significant increases or significant decreases in load times moving from a SATA drive to an NVMe drive. However, other games like Doom saw almost no advantages going from a hard drive to an SSD or to an NVMe SSD, right? So it's really going to depend on the application itself. If you're doing you know, heavy 4K video editing, maybe even up to 8K video editing, if you're a nutso, you're going to see a difference there, right? You're going to see the bandwidth improvement will be advantage there. But I don't think when we were pushing people to go from hard drives to SSDs so heavily, you know, 5, 6, 9 years ago, whatever it was, that was a life-changing PC experience for people. It is not the same going from SATA SSDs to NVMe SSDs. There's still differences there, but it's not quite the same, right? There's you know, a little bit of devaluation of those changes. So we'll see if, you know, consumer Optane drives make any difference. We'll see if any changes to the way the operating system interacts with storage in the coming years makes any changes. And hopefully we'll see some more improvements there. I think what you should take note of it is, once the storage is no longer a bottleneck for developers in any instance, like NVMe and Optane will do that, what application changes come to fruition as a result of that, right? Taking away bottlenecks in one place doesn't always result in immediate benefits, but benefits down the road. We'll do this last one. Jory Pira asks, or says, the PS4 Pro achieves 4K gaming with the help of checkerboard rendering. So why aren't we seeing 8K or higher resolutions on the PC using the same method? Because we don't need to, right? The PS4 Pro is aiming for 4K because they know people are going to attach it to a 4K television. So how can they get something that is closer to the native resolution of that screen? They do it with a checkerboard rendering, checkerboard rendering process. On the PC, we can, if you have a high enough end graphics card, you can render to 4K natively. And there's really no need for the checkerboard style, and we don't have 8K displays really yet, so why push up to that? But on the other side, there is super resolution exists on NVIDIA and AMD graphics, right? If you want to, and you have a 1080p screen, and you have the GPU horsepower for it, you can render the game at 4K and then have it display at 1080p. It's not quite the same thing. I realize we're kind of going the other way, but you can do that if you want to. On the other hand, you get a lot more flexibility in the PC games in terms of what resolution you want to run at, and if you're willing to sacrifice to drop from 60 to 30 frame rate in order to get 4K, as opposed to say 1080p or 2560 by 1440. So I don't think it's really something necessary yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of those rendering techniques do kind of fall back to the PC as we see the Xbox One X and then released out there and the PS4 Pro become more prevalent. So thank you guys for that. That is going to be it for this week. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the comment section below and we will add them to our list. And thank you guys for hanging out. Hopefully you guys find this useful and informative. If you do, like it, subscribe it, share it, do all the things that YouTube people tell you to do. Otherwise, I don't know what those are. So I do the best I can. But thank you guys for hanging out. I'll see you next week. Have a good one.